the southern colonies, we will discuss the same information as before: geography, location, culture, government, and economy. Alright, so the southern colonies, we'll take a look at geography. The southern colonies were developed as a argument between where should the South begin. So these two guys, Mason and Dixon, were hired to make a line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And they called this the Mason-Dixon line. South of that line is the South. And you still hear about the Mason-Dixon line. When we talk about the Civil War, we'll talk about what that line means. It basically separates the South from the rest of the country. So most northern would be Maryland, then Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And that's all that we have at this point in time. This region is largely known as the Tidewater region, and that may sound familiar to you after studying North Carolina geography, but there is a much larger Tidewater region that takes over most of the South. And it's characterized by its flat, lowland, swampy area. So if you think about when you're driving to the beach, I'm thinking of when I'm driving by the Outer Banks and you see all those swamps. It's like that all the way down to the south, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. And that area is characterized by warm, humid, hot summers, which is ideal for tobacco and rice growing. And then we'll also see it will be good for growing sugar as well. Taking a look at the map, the southern colonies make up this large portion. If you see here, Pennsylvania lies right here, and the Mason-Dixon line will come right on top of that on Maryland. So right over here. Taking a look at government, the South started to set up a very structured social system with social classes based on wealth. Near the coast, that's where many of the large plantations or large farms that produce a lot of crops and will get a lot of money, that's where most of the control took place because that's where the wealth was. So the people that had the most money controlled the government at this point in time. So you see a lot of that concentration near the coast, whereas the people that lived more inland or in the backcountry were kind of ignored. And when we take a look at culture, we'll talk about how they felt that way. In Maryland, we start to see the first act of toleration. George Calvert moved to Maryland to have a sanctuary for Catholics, where Catholics and Protestants could live in the same area. In England, this was not very successful. Catholics were highly persecuted for their religion due to the past with their history of control, and so this was kind of like a safe place for Catholics, but eventually there was a lot of tension between the Protestants that lived in Maryland and the Catholics. So they made an actual act of toleration saying, we are going to tolerate any religion. You can't persecute someone based on their religion in this state. So that was an actual law that was put into place that we considered a model for our First Amendment. Something interesting, Georgia was formed as a sanctuary for English debtors, so people that owed money to the king. And they banned slavery until 1750, and the way that they tried to do that was by making small farms. So instead of using that plantation system, which heavily relied on slaves at this time, which is very different from the rest of the region. But in 1750, that ban was repealed, and Georgia did become heavily based on the plantation system. Is very important in the South. It's something that's going to influence how the rest of history is told, and it's based on plantations. So plantations are large farms where you can produce a lot of crops to make a lot of money. But plantations are so large, they take a lot of people to make them profitable. So they need people working the farms, controlling the farms, and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Well, if you hire people to do this, then that costs a lot of money, which takes away from your profit, or the money that you end up taking home and putting in the bank, per se. So people in the southern colonies looked at the Caribbean and, okay, they have all these sugar cane plantations. How are they making this money? And they saw that they were using slavery. It started with Native Americans and then moved on to Africans after we know that many of them died off. So they started to include themselves in this triangular trade network, where many Africans were brought over here for the purposes of slavery as well. Some of the main crops that were produced on these plantations were tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton. Tobacco and cotton were mostly in like the North Carolina region. Rice and sugar was heavily in South Carolina. The backcountry, which I talked about as the area that was kind of ignored by the wealthy, this would be further inland, they still had small farms where they would make and produce stuff just for their families to live off of, or maybe for small profits. And this created a vast division between backcountry and the lowlands or plantation. They had a lot of hostility. So people from the backcountry, if they heard that you worked on a plantation, they'd probably roll their eyes and scoff at you, and vice versa. Backcountry didn't have a lot of control, so they didn't have a lot of the wealth. Charlestown, or present-day Charleston, became a major port in the global trade network. It's going to become the largest port in the Americas for quite some time, mainly due to South Carolina's large rice and sugar economy and coming in and out of that port. Culture in the southern colonies revolved around religious toleration. In Maryland, you start to see Catholics there instead of Protestants, which will make up majority of the Americas at this point. Also, due to African slaves being brought to our country, we do see an introduction of African customs into our culture. There are even parts of South Carolina and Georgia where people speak Gullah, which is a language based off of different African languages that can still be, you can still hear it being spoken today. Also different types of dance and also storytelling were implemented into the culture. And also the isolation of backcountry farmers, and it contributed to class division and also a lack of participation in government.